Namaskar. I welcome you all to our interview session of Ekhon Bangla Kobitar Kagoj. The name suggests the magazine of this time or moment. Today we have Turkish American poet Murat Nemet-Nejat with us. I welcome you, Murat, on behalf of Ekhon Bangla Kobitar Kagoj, edited by Runa Bandyopadhyay, whom you met during the Kolkata Book Fair, our poetry reading session in 2019. Otanu was the poet of the compact poetry movement, started in early 90s in Jalpaiguri, 700 kilometers away from the Kolkata. And his first poetry book, Diwali Moth Shundari, The Beautiful Moth on the Wall, published in 1994, with his journey in compact poetry. Here is his latest book, Surjasdesh Shahar, City of Sunset by Otanu Bandyopadhyay. I introduce briefly Murat. Murat Nemet-Nejat is a Turkish American poet born in Istanbul, Turkey, and lived in New Jersey, United States since 1959. He studied literature in USA, and he is the author of several poetry books. His first poetry book, The Bridge, published from Martin Bryan and O'Keeffe, London in 1977. The Bridge is a famous long poem by the American poet Hart Crane. Yet Murat took a challenge to convert the narrativeness of poetry in terms of the present times to make a communicative bridge of the cultural and language diversity between Turkish and American. While writing the poem, Murat was partly influenced by Opu of the film Pathe Pachali by Satyajit Ray. His second book, The Spiritual Life of Replicants,
not cooperating. I may have a. Yeah, I can have it here. Oh, here.
his second book, Spiritual Life of Replicants, published from Talisman in 2011. These poems were written based on Ridley Scott's fictional movie Blade Runner. The most radical thing in this book is that he equates the soul with consciousness, which is that aspect of the soul that seems most real, attached most closely to objective reality. His third book is Animals of Dawn, published from Talisman in 2016, where the central character is Hamlet of Shakespeare. Yet this is not a comparison of Hamlet, but a metaphor. It's a journey of a poet to search the metaphor between void and non-void, real and unreal, living and unliving, sanity and insanity. Io's Song, published from Jack's Press in 2019. If we split Io, it becomes the person, and O, a cry of desire or pain. The shifting sound permeates the vein of each poem in the book. He is not only a poet, but also a translator from Turkish to American English. Blind Cat Black and Orthodoxes of Age Ahan, published from Sun and Moon Press, Los Angeles in 1997. The second edition from Green Integer in 2015. I, Urban Valley, from Orphan Valley, published from Hanging Loose Press, New York in 1989. Then You All by Biran Keskin, published from Spuyen Duivel, New York in 2018. His The Peripheral Space of Photography, a book on photography published from Green Integer in 2003. He is the editor and translator of Eda, an anthology of contemporary Turkish poetry, published from Talisman House in 2016. This is not only a translation of a poetry and articles, but a translation of language, where translatability of a language depends on its distance from source language, as Walter Benjamin said. Murat has established this distance in this book, where central essence is the extract of Turkish theme, linguistics, and metaphysics. Murat, at the starting, I would like to ask you that you born in Turkey but write in American English, which you have learned in your college life. So, is there any influence or chemistry behind your choice of language in your poetic journey? Please tell us about your initial formation of your poetic life.
And what is unusual from the traditional way a poet chooses his or her language today is that the assumption that the poet writes in his or mother tongue is not there, is destabilized. Partly this is the result of our this global universe economy we live in, where a lot of activities are conducted in one language, whereas the language of our emotions really is another one. And that's the dilemma I faced when I came to the United States for the first time. And I was at school, at college here, in the middle of winter, minus 40-degree temperature in Massachusetts. I was very homesick. And because of that, I began to read Turkish poetry. And for the first time in my life, began to translate it. And that's how I began to write poetry. And why I chose English is kind of simple, is that I want to be heard by as many people as possible. And today, English is that language. But on the other hand, I was very aware that that language does not represent my psychic life, my emotional life. It does not resonate for me. So this was a dilemma. And to be able to, that's how I developed first in my essay, the questions of accent. How does a poet deal with it? Because even American poets are in exile to some extent because poetry, words is not central to American culture. Images are central. And then what I did, that I will take English as a foreign language and bend it to my own sensibility and shape it so it is able to express uh, my 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 emotional psychic life, and all my poetries that struggle between these two.
We would like to listen your poetry, please.
Yeah, but reading, I there's always uh, um, it- for me a conflict. Do I read from a book I already published so that everybody, or do I read something I'm doing now, I'm writing
Yes,
now?
yes, please.
And I decided I will go with the second one. The problem with that one is that when I'm writing a poem, I don't know where I'm going exactly. I jump. I write something. I don't know how it will relate. I write something else. I write something else. So it's messy. But on the other hand, it is more truthful to the way my mind as a poet works. So the new poem that I'm working is called Camels and Weasels, which is a phrase from Hamlet. He asks Hamlet, what do the clouds look like? Does it look camel like a weasels? And this poem is a continuation and called Performances from Hamlet. It's a continuation of Animals of Dawn. Animals of Dawn deals with the first act and half of it, where Hamlet sees the ghost and whatever, then he goes in the morning, confronts Claudius. The second poem is a very different kind of poem. Starts basically with a scene where Hamlet is supposedly insane and goes to the end of the play. And what I did, there is a passage, a famous passage. Hamlet is advising the players how you should play, and it says that the purpose of playing, whose end both at the first and now and was and is to hold, as it were, the mirror up to nature. So the poet holds a mirror to nature. Well, I said I will do something else. I'm not going to hold a mirror to nature. I would let nature acts itself in the poem. It's a little bit like Robert Bresson's idea of acting, non-acting. You see, if you are non-actors, you are truly become yourself. Okay. As a matter of fact, I wrote an essay about it. That Cora it is a Cora collection. So I will start with a few pieces from this group. And the way it looks, the poem is based on kind of little phrases from the play Hamlet, and then a performance out of it. Suicide, to sleep, perchance to dream, there's the rub. The fly hits the mirror and vanishes into its dream. Perform ends. The doors lament. I'm tired of closing and opening. A zone of unresolved silence. The crow spelled its name in the tree. It slithered out of my lips. The next one is about paper, performance of paper. Experiencing light as capturing something, but light's only singeing through us in every direction, home into a room called square root of -1 Olivian, my lines are tracing the after image of that light, while in the center of 19th century, trying to snare the image, light burns of itself, encountering matter, paper. Photographers were writing the earliest modern poems, movements of light waves of moment, etching the photographic image, light motion mutating into thought. Photographic image is thought. I am reading after image of thought. Where? Garden, there's another line from full of bread, flush of May. This is a phrase about, that's where Hamlet's father was killed, the garden. The man fell in the garden also in the Bible. So this is the garden. House, vertical creature. One enters it from the garden. The garden also perhaps was the house once. House, the garden, both suffering from the taste of the other's unknown, its flirtations veiled, a glance looks, its vortex strings. My soul is already strum disperses in liquid vibration. Oh, from the beginning, garden thought to choose an interior life, but garden must bend itself into the verticality of the house to enter it. Exactly, my dear sweetheart, a sunlit electric branch enters water, its dream-packed pickpocket mass. The dreams of the garden are leisurely, teeming with crawly insects, their clockwork occlusions. Buzz, buzz. My lady, may I lie between your legs? Nope. I meant on your lap. Kiss your lips. Worse and worse, my lord. No, my lady. Much, much warmer. Wormwood. Garden, the muddy singer of the street. Walking through the garden, the house appears. One saunters into the garden, but one flees from the garden. The garden's consciousness is sui generis. A selfie depicting oblivion surrounds the individual dream into which I wake. I dream I am wading. Water, what spelled WHAT, water. Oh, wait for her, then wake her. To me, oh Hamlet. Dynamism's cruel. Dreaming I jump into the ocean from a boat. To my horror, the boat sails away. No one to save me now. Sea to sea to sea. I committed suicide without knowing. Now is my time to die. Mistake act, no mulligan to take life. Now is long, life was too short. Death flying with a somewhat beauty. Entropy. Wake joins the backflow of waves, distinguished from them by its color. Then it disappears. God, looking at the waves, boat, disappearing in sunlight. When the eye, disappearing in sunlight when the eye closes. then only a sway of the waves. Wave becomes water, then water, sway, its wings approaching the waves for bobbing jettison somewhere in the mind, wake as the mind forms the backflow of waves, distinguished from them by its color, then it disappears.
So wonderful reading. Your reading reminds me the poet Tapan Roy, one of the editor of the New Poetry magazine, whom you whom you met in the same poetry reading session in Kolkata. He described the journey of new poetry. I will read in my translation. Tapan Roy writes, the New Poetry magazine was started with the desire to take the search for poetry further. The search never ends, and that is why, without this search, the new is impossible. Because new has no end. From the desire to turn poetry inside out, the poet's adventure starts its journey to an expanded consciousness that emerges from the center. With this thought, the New Poetry magazine, published in its one of its issue at the turn of 20th century, which was named "Step Out of Your Shoes." So, in this respect, right, in this, what do you think about the concept of new that that in your search for uncanonizable poetics that you mentioned in your essay, question of accent, with respect to Susan Way's word hesitations or Gertrude Stein's
Well, I am
Gertrude's
completely
use of repetitions or Dickinson's unproducible, that completely idiosyncratic utterance. So please,
I am completely in agreement with Brother Swapan here, and traditionally there is a problem with the new is that once it is new, then it quite quickly transforms itself into a shtick, into a conscious performance that can be perfected. To me, that's not the way poetry should work. You should really kind of constantly you have to find your way around it, and because of that, I feel every poem. In my case, they are fragments. I make my poetry out of fragments. Has the potential in itself of a moments of existence, but then included in it its own destruction. In a way, every poem, every fragment has both the ability to create itself for a moment of beauty, then destroy itself, so that you have no other choice but to start again. That's where the new, in my opinion, is able to remain new. It's not easy, it takes forever to write a poem like this, but I have
uh,
complete sympathy with what Swapam is saying.
okay, nice. I will just go for your uh, our my next question about your imagination. This our most radical poet Barin Ghoshal, the introducer of theory of expansive consciousness in Bengali poetics, he said in his book The Future of Poetry. I'll just translate it. Scientists live to unravel the mystery of the structures and movements of the world. A commoner doesn't have the intuition and imagination of a scientist, but a poet perceives the mystery of the world and our life. By seeking out the mystery of our existence, in fact, he seeks poetry and writes down his thoughts about the search. This he writes in his poetry book, in his essay book, Future of Poetry. I just translated here. This was discussed by the poet Umapadhyay, whom you met in the poetry reading session of Kolkata Book Fair. I would like to know that how this thought of intuition and imagination in poetry works for you.
Well, the key is, as Ghoshal said, the poet has to deal with the unknown or suppressed. Poetry doesn't deal with knowledge. Poetic language becomes vital when it is in struggle with the unknown, so that it has to stretch itself to comprehend something which is wild, which has not been domesticated, which has not become knowledge, so to speak, frozen. And to me, that's what imagination is. That's the struggle. And to the extent that a poet is able to continue to do this, then that process of expanding consciousness exists. And desire is what the Turkish poet Orhan Veli says. Every poem I wrote to women they thought it was about them, but actually I wrote them to keep busy. Okay. Or restlessness. That restlessness of the mind is, I think, the door to imagination.
Murat, actually, a lot of audience we have today. I'll just name them and their comments. Chapon Roy has already is there. His nice reading. Your reading is very nice. I know that you carry a cosmic consciousness in your reading. Then Pranab Kumar De, Mr. Murat, your poetry combining with the very inner thought of yours with a photographic language. Then Prabhat Mukherjee, hi to you. Then Pranab Pal, you met him in the during that poetry reading session. He is here. Then Uma Padukar, welcome Murat and Runa. Chapon Roy, Dhiman Chakraborty. Dhiman Chakraborty, I am here. Pijus Bishas, we are here now. Then we will start our next.
This is I'm kind of essentially I'm glad that my reading resonated with you, and
Yes.
that's until the pandemic, I made a point of coming and visiting Kolkata every year, and kind of I miss it, and so this is a very wonderful occasion for me, and I'm very much honored that you invited me to be part of this event.
Beauty is truth, truth, beauty is the legendary phrase of Keats, where truth of the objective world is transcendent to the truth of imagination. Not the visual value, but an alternative vision going beyond the limit of the traditional ekphrasis of the Grecian art. That is a vision of contrary through language, where your poem starts with expression, which is suppressed, assumed to be unreal by the traditional accepted expression of beauty, where language begins to crack, reaching its limit of expression. You call this limit as poem, and you used cracked American language as a tool in your poetry. Pranab, one of our radical poets in new poetry genre, whom you met in the same reading session. He took challenge of changing language and done his prolonged experimentation with the poetic language throughout 90s and beyond. In his book Bhashabadole Goddo, Prose on Language Alteration, published by New Poetry Publication, he writes, I will just read in my translation. Pranab writes, when the idea or the philosophy of poetry changes, it becomes necessary to form a suitable language to carry its weight. The imaginary words needed to be engaged with the unknown space that reveals its face with the expansive consciousness. It's a matter of feelings, and words in a language is very important, depending on which the backbone and the strength of the language and its speed are formed. When nouns and adjectives in a language can be used directly as verbs, the language becomes stronger and dynamic. So it is absolutely necessary to search for the new language to bring new dimension, new phonetics, new speed of by creating new words with the process of word recombination, verbification to shift uncommon nouns to verbs, adverbial and adjectival modification, abolition of pronouns, and to create an altogether different poetic language. So, in this respect, I would like to know the changes that this change of language works for your poetry, especially the visual poems or the play around the sound of words that you work in your last poetry book, Ayo Song.
You have
I
you made so many kind of interesting things about it, and so I may take a little bit longer than usual. First of all, in this Camels and Weasels poem, I have three different fragment poems about Keats. Okay, and one of them refers exactly to the phrase "truth is beauty, beauty truth." In my poem, that line becomes beauty is desire is beauty, beauty desire. And you see, the idea of truth is a very problematic idea, as we have been talking all the way through here. If, as Gosal says, what the poet deals with mystery, what you do not know, then how can beauty be truth? Okay. Whereas desire is something, it never ends, kind of, and you get something, you want more. That's why Keats is saying, I don't want to reach it, because the experience of wanting it is the most important experience. And Keats is a very, very important figure. Is that because a second very important concept he developed is the idea of negative capability, the ability to wait, stasis, to enter that gate that we are talking about. And what is so interesting about him is that Keats died when he was in his 20s. He was, instead of saying, I'm in a rush, I'm sick, I'm going to die, he talks about waiting. And in autumn, he chooses an ode on the season that comes at the end of the year, moment of maturity, where nature is in, and I agree completely with the thing is, Mr. Paul,
Pranappan.
when he talks about changing, his focus is on verb, kind of turn every word into a verb, and that must be something proper characteristics of Bengali language, that it has centrality. In Turkish, where I get my inspiration as language, words are more democratically spread out, so that for me, I can choose a preposition, I can choose a pronoun, I can choose a word. And years ago, when the anthology, Eda anthologies came out, I was having lunch with Jerome Rothenberg, who is also a great anthologist and a poet that you know. He asked me, he said, you know, this agglutination you talk about, the syntax of Turkish, which is not like English, we cannot understand it. Is it possible to explain the poetry? You express it as part of international modernism. Okay. And I said to him, no, you cannot. It is not a copy of the Western concept of modernism. It is something very different. Okay. And Eda is not international modernism. It is something else. It is very new, but it's not international avant-garde modernism. And after that, I began to think about it. And at that time, I was writing Spiritual Life of Replicants, as a matter of fact. And I realized, you see, what limits English as a language is it's very, very strict syntax. You cannot change the order of words in English very easily. The moment you do it, it sounds poetic. It doesn't sound natural. Okay. And we don't want that. We want a very authentic language. And and I already had a lot of interest in films for many reasons. And film has its own language in space. Where you put a word, an image, where it means something very different. And I realized that if I give a dimension to words in space, I abolish the syntax. Syntax, if you respond to words not in terms of logical grammar, but with your eye, with your instincts, with your impulse, the chaotic way the mind works, then you bring that dimension into English. And my idea as a poet, an American poet, is to make the language develop into a new direction that can accommodate a language of the spirit, really, not a positivist kind of Descartesian concept of language, not everything. No, language has inherent in it a sense of there are things you cannot express. Okay, and that's basically my struggle. That's what I try to do. Yeah, and even in Io's song particularly, punctuation works not as grammar; it works as musical notation. Okay, the way it. So that's the way I try to break and try to push language into direct spaces where it did not exist before.
Wonderfully said. Uh, Descartes' dictum, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. It was extended to prove the existence of God, but it turned out in your book, The Spiritual Life of Replicants, you write as, I exist. because I may cease to exist. I may not exist, therefore I am. This is to attack the Cartesian split between the body, which is a machine, and the soul. You have made the turning test, one of your poem's name, with android and human in the sense of whether they belong to the same continuum where deterministic objective reality dissolves into subjective indeterminacy. So because all our experiences are the manifestations of our continuous interaction with the material world, which are not static, but it's vibrating and engaged in endless rhythm and actions. So in this indeed resonates with modern science also. And in this respect, I would like to know your treatment of mortality and immortality with EYEI, and I, with body and soul, to weave your language with the postmodern variants from transcendence to say immanence.
Uh,
Please.
it is. I have a phrase I think in Io's song. I say a poem is the safe deposit of the soul. Okay, is that if a poem can maybe a record of a moment of consciousness, then it's possible that somebody, when you are not around here, somebody reads it that may share that moment of consciousness with me. And but to be able to do that, there is no, in my opinion, there is no consciousness but by looking at yourself. There's nothing there. You see, you have a body here, and it is really moving. I think you in Hinduism, for example, that I think that I may be wrong, but the way I interpret it, the ego is an illusion. That's the ego that is being talked about. That to say the purpose of the poem is to enter the consciousness, to enter what is outside you, the physical animal world, physical world. I mean, that's especially with Camels and Weasels is about that. The poems I've read there about kind of there. And how does a door feel like? You know, you don't know how a door feels like, but kind of this empathy. And yeah, I mean, I don't have the answer to it. Time, yeah, I very much believe is that we are, time is so important for us because mankind, man knows, human beings know, time is limited, you are going to die. Okay. It's a scarce commodity, time. That's why we divide it into past, present, future. If
Yes.
we did not have this consciousness of dying, we wouldn't do this. You know, we don't think about it the same way about water, you know. Okay, and you know what? Yeah, we do think about it. Water becomes ice, becomes clouds, you know. So the changes, transformations bring up the consciousness, and death is the biggest transformation, really, and into biggest mystery. And that's it. That's I think. Otherwise, you mentioned in some other in Animals of Dawn about the distinction I make,
Yes.
slow time and
I
fast time. Yeah.
actually I was that time, that concept of time you have used in Animals of Dawn. I was really amazed with that. About time, our poet Dhiman Chakraborty writes in his book Beje Otha Surjasto, Ringing Sunset, in 2019. I will just read what he has written in Bengali. I have just translated. There is nothing called time. It's just naming of the entire movement as past, present, and future. The physical time that we relate to the clock has no meaning to the poet. The clock tells nothing, doesn't have any relation with efflux of time, rather points to the dynamicity of being. Time lies in the midst of our concept and activities. With expanded consciousness, a poet of new poetry wants to fly into the infinite sky of poetic freedom, as if flying in a spaceship that makes the movement towards the never ending, wondrous world. Just I would like to ask you in this respect that you use the concept of delayed time in Hamlet of Shakespeare play in your book Animals of Law. Please.
Yeah, delayed time is the gate, and it's a spaceship to go to outer space. Actually, science fiction is a very vital form for our time, and it is not. It's, and I like that, and I use the Blade Runner, and one of the main characters there goes up into the space. They come out of space. Yet, in fact, the whole spiritual life of replicas, though I talk about it in Animals of Dawn, but if you look at the spiritual life of replicas, the idea of slow time developed there, because what happens is that there are short poems in spiritual life. Suddenly you have this visual poems that come in. And when you encounter this visual poem where you cannot read it in any normal way, it freezes you there and focuses the mind on a space, on the relationship among words and space. And this is the time. It is duration. What Bergson talks. Time is duration, which is a subjective experience of time. So that subjectively, as Einstein tells us, time is really basically depends on the individual point of view. It is not an object. There's no objective time here, and that's what we are kind of talking about. We have practical time. We have to do it, but that's the most subjective time of all, because we are talking about our human existence, whereas the whole universe around here, and we are like kind of. There are certain sounds we don't hear, certain things we don't see, and probably there are certain thoughts we are unable to think.
So we will come to Murat. I would like to come to your translational work now.
Yeah.
Your most famous and controversial anthology, Eda, an anthology of contemporary Turkish poetry, where you say Eda is distance from the host language that makes a language translatable. And Eda stands for the essence of all the authentic hallmark of Turkish culture and poetics. So, could you please tell us how this wonderful poetics of Eda works for your translation?
Well, the whole thing started in some way with the Edda anthology, and when I began to write it, is by you see the struggle that I had, and people I know, many poets in Turkey has, and perhaps many other countries with in minor languages, not English. Let's say we don't write in English or one of the major Western language, but English, I think mostly, is that if they want to be heard, they feel they have to let the other language appropriate you, so that you can call this poet a Turkish Walt Whitman or Turkish Rambo or something like this. No, those poets are not Turkish Rambos. They come from someplace else. It was absolutely important for me to create a poetics in Eda that cannot be appropriated, completely understood. That's what J. Rothenberg is saying. I don't know what agglutination is exactly. I'm glad still people don't quite understand it, because to the extent that they don't understand it, they cannot own it. They have to extend themselves to understand something they do not know. Okay, and that's what I try to do, and that's what the translation does. That's what distance is. Is that the idea is that you translate a poem so that you have another poem of the kind you already know. Then why do you translate it? You want to add to your treasure of poems? No, poetry, as we've been talking about, it involves extension of language. New, the idea of new. To apply the idea of newness to translation, you have to translate distance, not similarity.
Could you read this? Shapondra has telling.
Uh, yeah. Thank you, Swapan. You put me face to face with one of my poems. That, yes, I wrote the poem. Kind of. I picked up phrases from one or two Turkish poets and I put it myself. Yes, see, the bubble. I have a poem in the new poem called "Bubble of Creation of Space." To me, about Cantor, mathematician, 19th century mathematician, had to go to the insane asylum because people thought he had gone utterly bonkers, is that he talks about transfinite sets. There can be one set which is infinite. Then you can have another set which is also infinite that has the other set in it. How can you have it's infinite? How can you be a subset of it? Well, I'm not a mathematician. I'm sure that mathematicians have very clear answers to them, but I'm not. So I'm trying to understand mathematical agglutination, really. And I said it means that what we call infinity exists in sets. That is to say, things are infinite within a system. Okay. And if you break into the system through the system, then there's a different rules. There are different kind of infinities, different assumptions. You can have the square root of -1. How can you have square root of -1? You repeat minus by minus becomes plus. How can you have it? Okay, where do you have it? Okay, not perhaps here, but you have it there. And I realize in translation, for example, every language is an infinite to the other language. That's what Walter Benjamin talks about, intention of the language. You cannot translate them. They have their own integrity. And you have to break something. I have the essay, I have it, essay, translation and style. I say every translation starts with a misreading. What does that mean? It means that you have to crack it to release its potential. Okay. We are not talking about reproducing things. We are talking about exploring potentials. And I don't know, Swapan, did that answer your question? This is little bottle expanding and standing still, and any moment ready to burst. What can I say?
I will come to our last question, Murat. I appreciate your exploration for a new language in the photographic medium, as you have done in your book, The Peripheral Space of Photography. because here one photographer is present, Pranab Kumar De. You are replacing the photographer with the viewer. And this is to say that the dialogue in the photograph is not between the photographer and the subject, but the viewer and the photograph with the subject. In other words, the photographer as the creator of an aesthetic frame is eliminated. And Murat, what I like to know that how this idea helped you in the construction of your process of poetry.
All my ideas of my poetry is developed in that essay about photography. Okay, you can say that. And perhaps the essay questions of action, but in terms of poetics, that essay is an attack on modern aestheticism of construction, of symmetrical collages. I am for a poetry of chaotic process. Okay. So what I do, photography, for example, that essay is a reaction to an exhibition in Metropolitan Museum, where every photograph is put in a frame, a work of art. And I first realized that when I was looking at those photographs, great photographs, those frames were bothering me. They were kind of in between, so to speak. All right. And then I developed an idea is that what is interesting about photograph is that it records things that the photographer is not aware of. A lens is a robot, okay? It doesn't have prejudices. You can focus it on one direction, but once it's in that place, it has no prejudices. It accepts everything, okay? And it means that if you remove the photographer out of the way and you liberate the watcher of the photograph to look at those images, little things that sees, and let the mind freely react to it, you liberate both what is inside the photograph, those people were taking the objects and everything, and give and empower the looker. And since every looker is different, so for different people, that photography will resonate in a different way. They are all authentic. There is no truth. Okay, and like what really happens in my poetry that I wasn't thinking that way when I wrote the essay, but turned out is that I empower the reader. I want a poetry which is open-ended. For example, Animals of Dawn, you're talking about. My purpose, the only thing I knew when I began to write, I knew that I want to write a poem that you struggle, you search and search and search, you end up finding no answer. You are more or less at the same place. And the outcome of it is that it becomes authentically an open-ended poem. You can really go this and ask. The last line of the poem, I think, is a question, whether Photoshop would have made the message clearer. No, I don't want a Photoshop. I like the way photograph, those blurs, mistakes, accidents. That's the way language works. And yeah, that's very important. That's very, very important to me, because Io's song, as a matter of fact, creates this problem text. That is to say, how do you read it? Even to me, once I wrote that poem, the poem died for me. I have to relive. I have to be a new reader of it, and I believe that kind of poetry. That's what I'm struggling with, Camels and Weasels. So I liberate myself from Io's song and write something else. Yeah.
You have a question from Uma Padukar.
Yes, they're more or less the same thing, and the objects are the state of mind. As a matter of fact, I think Gosal says this, doesn't it? They kind of basically, one of the passages you quoted, uh, that complete fusion of the mind, looking at the poem and the words and the objects in it, they are basically, language becomes immanent. That is, the body of language becomes an embodiment of consciousness. Yeah,
Uh, you are you are having from he is photographer Pranab Kumar Dev.
I'm very glad. Yeah, there is a lot of affinity. This is what I've been talking about, and as a matter of fact, in the last several years, it's one of the biggest surprises in my life is that when I was doing this thing, uh, there was a quantum resonance in another part of the world that we were kind of struggling with the same language. I knew this from, I didn't know this. I was told this from Aryan Mukherjee, who is a very close friend of mine in the United States. Many of you know. And, when he read the anthology, he said, that anthology kind of talks about very much Bengali. It can be a poetics for a Bengali poet. I didn't know what he meant, kind of, please but he, I understand he wrote essays about it, but he never translated one of them to me into English. So to this day, I don't know exactly what he wrote. But when I was there last time, during that meeting we had in the coffee shop, and when Umapada read from Gosal about, and I asked him, do you mean that he says the unreal is also real? Because the language was very abstract and kind of metaphysical, and I wanted to understand it. And he said, then I turned to Runa. She was sitting next to me. I kind of smiled, and I realized why Animals of Dawn spoke so much
Um,
to you as poets. Yeah.
I can see the clock is ticking, and it's very difficult to explore a versatile poet like Murat in this short period. We have to sit again with him. Murat, if you like to tell something to our organizer, Ekhon Bangla Kobitar project.
I want to do something. This Ekhon Bangla Kobitar, Kagoj. Did I pronounce it correctly? Okay.
Correct.
Yeah, I think it's a very exciting project. I think, and because we need these communications that we are having, different cultures, and for me, it's particularly important. It's coming from from different part of the world. Okay, but it has its own integrity because, as I said, in the West, the tendency to transform everything into its own image. Okay, and was something I struggled all my life as a poet, refusing to be assimilated that way, and I think this is very important part of that project.
Well, we are at the end, which is not the end, but the end of the beginning. Thank you so much, Murat, you for joining with us, and my special thanks to all our audiences, without whom the session would not have been exciting and interesting. And I sincerely appreciate your time and attention. I look forward to your presence in our next interview session. Namaskar.
Thank you very much. I hope so, and thank you for the audience, all of you. I say hello to you. Hopefully, see you soon. And
Thank you.
great.